At 55 years old, Silas had $14 in his checking account, a suspended sentence on his permanent record, and a night shift at the Southside Industrial Paper Recycling Plant. 10 years ago, he had been a master book conservator, a man who spent his days in temperature-controlled vaults preserving history. Now he fed it into a 2-ton shredder for minimum wage. The factory floor smelled of diesel exhaust, bleached pulp, and rotting cardboard. Silas stood beside conveyor belt number 4, wearing thick rubber gloves and a high-visibility vest that hung loosely on his thin frame. His job was manual sorting. He watched the endless river of trash flow toward the massive steel teeth of the primary shredder. Cardboard boxes, tax records, moldy paperbacks, wet magazines. The conveyor belt rattled, the warning light flashed yellow, the blades hummed with a deep, bone-rattling vibration. Every time he heard the metal teeth crunch through a stack of paper, a small part of him died. The klaxon sounded, signaling a new delivery. A dump truck backed into the loading bay and released its payload onto the primary belt. An estate clean-out batch. Silas could tell by the mix of heavy drapery fabric, shattered picture frames, and moisture-damaged library boxes. The debris cascaded down the metal chute, spreading along the moving rubber belt. Silas scanned the pile, pulling out chunks of metal and plastic that would jam the blades. He was 50 feet from the shredder, then 40, then 30. That was when he saw it. It was buried under a pile of shredded packing paper, looking like nothing more than a cinder block of gray mud and fibrous rot. Swollen, misshapen, soaked through with what looked like river water. To anyone else on the floor, it was just another piece of heavy garbage. But Silas had spent 30 decades training his eyes to see what others could not. As the lump tumbled over a broken piece of drywall, a section of the mud scraped away, revealing a flash of pale, cream-colored material underneath. It was not cardboard. It was not industrial paper. The texture was distinct, fibrous yet smooth, holding a specific tension even when saturated. Vellum. Calfskin vellum, tanned using methods that hadn't been practiced since the late 19th century. The lump was 20 feet from the grinding teeth. Silas lunged forward, stretching his arm over the guardrail, his gloved fingers grasping at the wet mass. Too heavy, too far, 10 feet. He slammed his hand against the red emergency stop button mounted on the steel pillar. The conveyor belt shrieked, the massive gears grinding to a halt with the sound like a dying animal. The silence that followed was absolute. A second later, the foreman was shouting from the catwalk above, waving his clipboard, reminding Silas that an unauthorized stoppage meant an automatic deduction of half his monthly paycheck. Silas ignored him. He climbed over the guardrail, stepped onto the stationary belt, and dug the swollen mass out of the debris. It weighed at least 10 pounds in its waterlogged state. He carried it to the break room sink, ignoring the stares of the other line workers. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. He turned on the faucet, keeping the pressure low, barely a trickle. He washed away the black mud. He washed away the grease. His hands were shaking. He hadn't touched a historical artifact in 10 years, and the fear of doing further damage warred with a need he thought he'd buried along with his old life. As the last of the grime sluiced down the stainless steel drain, the true shape of the object emerged. A book. Massive, bound in thick leather over heavy wooden boards, its pages fused into a solid brick of moisture and mold. It belonged in the trash, and yet here it was, in his hands, at 2 a.m. Silas reached for a stack of brown paper towels, gently dabbing the excess water from the front cover. The leather was nearly black with rot, but in the center of the board, something caught the harsh overhead light. He wiped away the last layer of grime. A crest, blind-tooled, worn almost smooth but unmistakable. An eagle, wings spread, clutching a broken scale in its talons. Silas stopped breathing. He had seen that shape before, not in a museum, not in a textbook. He had seen it stamped across the letterhead of the papers that ended his life 10 years ago, the ones he had spent a decade not to picture, folded into a drawer he never opened. He didn't say the name out loud, not yet. He just stood there in a room that smelled of bleach and burnt coffee, holding 100 years of someone else's secrets in his ruined hands, in the last place on earth he ever expected history to find him again. His fingers lingered on the board a moment longer than they should have. It was heavier than it looked, thicker than any binding of this size had a right to be. Silas wrapped the book in his jacket, tucked it under his arm like something that might still bleed, and walked out past the foreman without a word. Nobody stopped him. Nobody ever stopped a man carrying garbage out of a garbage plant. The walk home took 40 minutes. He didn't feel the cold. His apartment was a single room above a laundromat, the kind of place that came with a hot plate and a landlord who never asked questions. He'd lived there for 6 years and owned almost nothing in it. But in the closet, behind a row of empty hangers, there was a cardboard box he hadn't opened since the day they walked him out of the archives in handcuffs he never had to wear because nobody wanted the humiliation photographed. Inside that box, bone folders, a set of Japanese brushes, bristles still soft, a humidity gauge with a cracked face, tools he'd told himself for 10 years he would never touch again. He touched them now. His hands remembered the weight of a bone folder before his mind gave permission. That frightened him more than the book did. He cleared the small kitchen table, laid down a sheet of blotting paper, and set the ruined volume on top of it under the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Up close, in better light, the damage was worse than he'd hoped and better than he'd feared. The leather had lifted at the corners, but the sewing structure, when he pressed a thumb gently along the spine, still held. Whoever had bound this book had built it to survive things like this. He would need a freeze dryer. A real conservator would have one, a stainless steel chamber, professional grade, humming quietly in a climate-controlled lab with a technician logging every degree. Silas had a mini-fridge with a broken ice maker and a shop vacuum pump he'd bought for $9 at a yard sale 2 years ago and never used. It would have to do. He spent the next 2 hours on his knees in front of the fridge, gutting the interior, sealing the door gasket with plumber's tape, running a hose from the vacuum pump through a hole he drilled into the side panel. Lyophilization, they'd called it in school, freeze-drying. The theory was simple enough to explain to a child and difficult enough to ruin a career if you got it wrong. Heat pulled water out of paper by evaporation, and evaporation dragged the swollen cellulose fibers apart as it went, turning 300-year-old pages into something closer to ash. But water frozen solid, then drawn out under vacuum, skipped the liquid state entirely. Ice went straight to vapor. The fibers never had the chance to collapse. The book would come out brittle, maybe, cold and strange to the touch, but it would come out whole. He placed the volume inside, set the makeshift chamber to its lowest setting, and switched on the pump. It coughed twice, then settled into a low, steady drone that would run for 3 days straight, eating through more electricity than Silas could afford and not caring in the slightest. He sat on the floor with his back against the cabinet and watched the little gauge needle hold steady, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt something in his chest that he didn't have a name for anymore. It wasn't hope. Hope required believing something good was coming. This was smaller than that. This was just his hands, doing the one thing they still knew how to do. The foreman didn't fire him. Firing meant paperwork, and paperwork meant someone upstairs might ask why a man with Silas's record had been standing anywhere near that belt in the first place. Instead, a notice went up on the breakroom board the next afternoon. 3 days, unpaid, effective immediately. His name spelled out for anyone walking past to read. 3 days with no shift to report to and no pay coming to cover it. Silas didn't argue. He didn't have the energy or the standing to. He stayed in the apartment and let the pump run, leaving only once for the 4 minutes it took to walk to the corner store for a jug of distilled water, counting what was left of his $14 each time the door closed behind him. On the second night, he didn't sleep at all, just sat listening to the pump hum through the wall, running the math on what would happen to his rent if the compressor blew. It didn't blow. Just past midnight on the third night, the pump clicked off on its own. The pressure had finally leveled out, exactly the way the manual he'd memorized 20 years ago said it should. Silas opened the chamber and lifted the book out with both hands. It was lighter, dry. The leather had drawn tight against the boards, stiff as old rope, and the pages, when he tested the edge with one careful fingernail, held their shape instead of crumbling. He exhaled for what felt like the first time in 3 days. Then he noticed the front board again. He ran his palm flat across it, the way he used to run a palm across 100 boards a year, back when that was simply what his hands did for a living. Something was wrong with the proportions. A binding of this size and period should have measured somewhere between 2 and 3 millimeters through the board, enough to protect the pages, not enough to waste good oak. This one was closer to 7. He found the calipers in the cardboard box and measured it twice because the first number didn't seem possible. 7 millimeters, more than double what it should have been. He rapped his knuckles against the center of the board, the way you'd knock on a wall to find a stud. The sound that came back wasn't the dense, solid thud of packed wood and leather. It was hollow, faint but unmistakable, the sound of empty space where empty space had no business being. Silas sat very still, the book balanced on his knees, his knuckle still resting against the board. Someone had built this cover to hide something, and they had built it well enough to survive a river, a landfill, and a shredder. He was reaching for a scalpel when the knock came at his door. 3 knocks, firm, deliberate, not the sound of a neighbor, and not the sound of anyone who had ever knocked on that door at 2 in the morning, or any hour at all. Silas didn't move. The knock came again, softer this time, followed by a voice pitched low enough not to carry through the walls. "Silas, I know you're in there. I can see the light under the door." He knew that voice. It took him a moment to place it, the way you place a smell before a face, and when he did, his chest went tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He opened the door to find Eleanor Voss standing in a wool coat buttoned to her chin, her white hair pinned back the same careful way it had been for 30 years, a canvas tote bag hanging from one shoulder, like she'd come from the grocery store instead of appearing at his door in the middle of the night. She had been the head of manuscripts at the archives, once 2 floors up from his old lab. The kind of colleague who remembered everyone's birthday and never once believed the story they told about him. "I heard the pump," she said, before he could ask anything. "Through the wall, 3 nights running. I live in 4B, Silas. I've lived here since April." He hadn't known that. 10 years, and the world had kept moving in rooms right next to his without him noticing any of it. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you." Her eyes moved past him, into the apartment, to the kitchen table under the bare bulb, to the book sitting open on a bed of blotting paper with a scalpel laid beside it. Something in her face changed. She stepped inside without being asked, the way old colleagues do, and set her bag down on the counter without looking away from the table. "May I?" Silas stepped aside. She crossed the room slowly, the way she used to approach anything fragile, hands clasped behind her back until she was close enough to look without touching. She studied the spine first, then the boards, then the faint remains of the blind-tooled crest he'd uncovered 3 nights ago. Her breath caught, just barely, a sound so small he might have imagined it if he hadn't spent 30 years learning to read the smallest sounds a person made around old paper. "Where did this come from?" she said. It wasn't really a question. "The recycling plant, an estate clean-out." He hesitated. "I pulled it off the belt." "You pulled it off the belt?" She repeated it flatly, like she was testing whether the sentence would hold weight if she said it twice. Then she reached out and turned the front board toward the light, tracing the worn edge of the crest with one finger, careful not to press. "Do you know whose workshop bound this, Silas?" "I know the crest. I don't know the workshop." "The crest is the Sterling family seal." She said the name the way you'd set down something heavy, gently, both hands, making sure it landed without breaking anything underneath it. "Sterling was the family seal. But the binding is Ashworth and Sons. There were only 3 families in this city who could afford Ashworth work, and only one of them kept a private library large enough to need a volume this size. You're not holding an estate clean-out, Silas. You're holding something that was never supposed to leave that house." The name sat in the room between them for a long moment. Silas hadn't heard it spoken aloud in 10 years, not once, not by a single person, because he had made sure of it. He'd crossed streets to avoid newsstands. He'd left rooms when it came up on the radio. He had built an entire decade around never having to hear 4 syllables that used to mean everything he'd worked for, and now meant only the day it had all been taken from him. "Sterling was the name on the complaint," he said quietly. 10 years ago, they said I stole a manuscript out of my own department. Digital logs, forged signatures, all of it clean enough that nobody thought to ask why a man 3 years from a pension would risk it for a book he could never sell. I never believed it. Eleanor's voice was steady, but her jaw was tight. I told the board that at the time. Nobody wanted to hear it from a manuscripts librarian with no evidence, just 30 years of knowing you well enough to know it wasn't in you. Silas said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't crack something open he'd spent 10 years keeping shut. Eleanor set her bag on a chair and rolled up her sleeves like the matter was decided. "Get the kettle going. If there's something built into that board, hot water and patience will get it out cleaner than a blade will. You know that better than I do." They worked like they used to work, without needing to talk through each step. Silas held the board flat, while Eleanor fed a folded cloth soaked in near-boiling water along the seam where the leather met the wood, softening the animal glue a hair's width at a time. Rabbit skin glue, the old formula, the same reason the binding had survived a river and a landfill instead of dissolving into paste. It was the one adhesive in the world that could sleep for 200 years and still wake up soft under enough steam. The first layer came away clean, then the second. By the third, Silas could see the board wasn't solid wood at all, but 4 thin sheets of waste paper, pressed and glued into a single mass, the cheap trick every binder of the period used to save good oak. Between the third and fourth sheets, where there should have been nothing but more pressed pulp, his scalpel caught on an edge that didn't belong. A cavity, shallow, no deeper than a matchbook, cut with a precision that hadn't come from decay or accident. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of oiled cloth gone the color of weak tea, were two things: a small round lens, the glass tinted a deep, uneven gold, set into a thin brass ring worn smooth from handling, and beneath it, folded into quarters so tight the creases had nearly worn through, a single sheet of paper covered in handwriting the color of dried blood. Eleanor lifted it out with 2 fingers, the way you'd lift something that might still be alive. The ink had rusted into the page over the decades, corroding the fibers along every stroke, a signature of iron gall ink that no modern pen could fake. She unfolded it under the bulb. Verse, not prose. 6 lines, formal, the kind of thing a man wrote when he wanted to hide something inside something beautiful. Silas read it twice and understood none of it. Something about a tide that kept no calendar, a debt paid in silence, a door that opened only to the patient hand. Below the verse, in a different hand entirely, cramped and plain where the poem was elegant, someone had added a single line, almost an afterthought, the kind of thing a craftsman scrawls when he thinks no one important will ever read it. Bound by hand for the count, by the man who taught me everything I know about paper and patience. Eleanor went very still. "What?" Silas said. She didn't answer right away. She was staring at the line she'd once stared at forged signatures for a living, running the shape of each letter against something in her memory that hadn't moved in decades. "I've seen this hand before," she said finally. "Not this line, this hand. The slant, the way he crosses his T's low, almost through the middle of the letter." She shook her head slowly, more at herself than at him. "It's in a ledger back at the archives, a binder's logbook from the 1890s. I cataloged it myself 20 years ago, and I never thought about it again until right now." "Whose ledger?" "I don't remember the name attached to it. I remember the handwriting because it was beautiful and because whoever kept it never once wrote his own name in his own book, only everyone else's." She looked up at him, and something behind her eyes had shifted, the careful stillness of a woman doing arithmetic she didn't like the answer to. "I'll need to see it again to be certain." Silas picked up the lens instead, turning it toward the bulb, the glass throwing a warm amber circle onto the tabletop. He lowered it over the blank space just beneath the verse, the one part of the page that carried no ink at all, on the theory that whoever built a hidden compartment inside a book didn't stop at one secret. Nothing happened. The paper stayed blank under the gold glass, exactly as blank as it had looked without it. He tried the facing page. Nothing. He tilted the lens, caught the light at a different angle, moved it slowly across every inch of both sheets. Still nothing. Eleanor reached over and took the lens gently from his hand, holding it up to her own eye and studying the paper the way she used to study a document she suspected of lying to her. "This isn't the right light," she said, half to herself. "Whoever hid this wanted more than one key. The glass gets you this far and no further." She set the lens down on the folded verse, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the kettle ticking as it cooled on the stove behind them, the city outside gone quiet, the way it only does somewhere close to 3 in the morning. "There's a kind of light," Eleanor said slowly, "that shows you writing no eye was ever meant to see. I still have access to the conservation lab. I could—" She stopped herself, glancing at him, weighing something. "It would mean going back into that building, Silas, the one that took your name away." He didn't answer for a long moment. The bulb overhead buzzed faintly, the same sound it had made every night for 6 years, suddenly unbearable. "Then don't go in," he said. "Bring it here." Eleanor studied him, the way she used to study a page before deciding whether it was worth the risk of turning it. Then she nodded once, gathered her coat, and left without another word, the kind of silence that meant she understood exactly what he wasn't saying. She was back before the sky had fully lightened, a black case tucked under her arm, her expression giving away nothing about how she'd gotten a portable UV unit out of a secured conservation lab at 4 in the morning. Silas didn't ask. Some debts were better left uncounted. They cleared the table. Eleanor drew the thin curtain over the single window, and Silas switched off the overhead bulb, plunging the room into a darkness broken only by the streetlight bleeding faint orange through the fabric. He clicked the UV lamp on. The wand hummed. A cone of violet light spilled across the page, and the paper answered it. Faint lines bloomed across the blank space beneath the verse, invisible under any ordinary bulb, written in something that fluoresced pale and ghostly under the ultraviolet glow. Not ink exactly, something mixed to hide from every light except this one. Numbers, rows of them, small and cramped, running the width of the page. "Iron sulfate wash," Eleanor murmured, leaning close enough that her breath fogged faintly in the cold room. Invisible until struck by the right wavelength. Whoever wrote this didn't want a casual reader finding it. He wanted someone who already knew to look. Silas reached for the amber lens, holding it between the UV light and the page, the way you'd hold a filter over a lamp. The gold glass bent the glow, and where the raw numbers had looked like static, they sharpened, the false digits fading, the true ones rising clean through the noise. He copied them on the back of an old receipt with a pencil stub, hands steadier than they had any right to be. 2 strings of numbers, coordinates. Eleanor pulled a battered road atlas from her tote bag, the kind of thing nobody carried anymore, and thumbed to the end papers where the world was printed small and flat. She traced the first number down, the second across, her fingers stopping somewhere in open blue, nowhere near a coastline, nowhere near anything. "That's open ocean," she said, "middle of the Atlantic." Silas checked the numbers again, recalculated, checked a third time. The answer didn't move. A century-old riddle, 4 days of work, 3 nights without sleep, and it pointed at nothing but water. Something in his chest that had been holding steady since the moment he pulled the book off the belt gave out all at once. He picked up the volume, the same one he'd carried home wrapped in his own jacket, like it might still bleed, and slammed it down on the table, hard enough that the lens skittered off the edge, and Eleanor flinched back with a small, sharp breath. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Silas saw it. A thin seam of gold light, no wider than a hair, glowing along the closed edge of the pages where the book had struck the table and the leaves had fanned out under the impact. He went still. Carefully, the way his hands remembered how to be careful, even when the rest of him had forgotten, he lifted the book and bent it gently against the spine, fanning the pages open at an angle no reader would ever hold a book. The gilt edge, the one that looked like plain gold leaf when the book sat closed on a shelf, split apart under the curve of his thumb into hundreds of thin painted lines, each one hiding on the edge of a single page, invisible until the pages fanned just right and the fragments lined up into a single image. "Four-edge painting," Eleanor breathed, and for the first time all night she sounded like she was standing in a classroom again instead of a stranger's kitchen at dawn. 18th century. A binder would paint a miniature scene across the fanned edge of the pages, then gild the flat edge over top so it vanished the moment the book closed. You could own one for 40 years and never know it was there. Silas held the fan of pages steady and stared at what a century of hiding had preserved. A building, rendered in miniature, in strokes too fine for any brush he'd ever used, but unmistakable in its shape. A low stone facade, a bell tower off-center, a wrought iron gate with a design he had somehow seen before, though he couldn't place where. He reached for the amber lens with his free hand and held it over the painted edge, angling it the way Eleanor had angled it over the blank page hours ago. Red ink surfaced beneath the gold and the color, hidden in a second layer beneath the visible miniature. Not a picture this time, a string of characters, precise, deliberate, an account number, a bank name half legible, printed small enough to have survived a century of gold leaf without anyone knowing it was there to survive. Silas lowered the book slowly onto the table, careful not to lose the angle, careful not to let 100 years of patience collapse now that it had finally spoken. "I know that building," he said. Eleanor looked. "I don't know from where, but I've seen that gate." He stared at the miniature a moment longer, the bell tower, the low stone wall, something scratching at the edge of memory and not quite reaching him. "It's recent, not something from 10 years ago, something I've seen since." Eleanor reached for a fresh sheet to blot the water pooling near the lens, pulling it from the stack of old newsprint Silas kept folded under the sink. Plant salvage, bundles the sorting line rejected before they ever reached the pulper, the closest thing to conservation-grade blotting paper he could still afford. He hadn't read a newspaper in 10 years. He used them. That was different. That felt safer somehow, to only ever look at the paper and never at what was printed on it. Eleanor unfolded a sheet to blot it flat and stopped. "Silas." He looked up. She turned the page toward him, one corner already damp, the date at the top 3 days old, the same morning he'd been standing at the belt, the same morning the book came down the line. Below the fold, a photograph he didn't need more than a glance to place. The same low stone facade, the same off-center bell tower, the same wrought iron gate, rusted now where the painting had shown it new, but unmistakable in its shape. "St. Jude's Home for Children to close," the headline read. "Sterling Development secures demolition permit for century-old facility." Silas stared at a building he had been carrying home in his own pocket for 3 days without ever knowing it was there to be. "Silas," Eleanor said quietly, setting the damp newsprint down beside the fanned pages, the 2 images sitting side by side under the bare bulb, one painted by a hand dead for 100 years, the other printed by a machine that morning. Whoever built that hiding place wasn't protecting money. Eleanor left before the sun was fully up, promising to bring back the ledger from the archives the moment she could get near it without questions. Silas didn't wait for her to return. He folded the damp newspaper page into his coat pocket, the one with the photograph of the gate, and walked the 11 blocks to St. Jude's before he'd fully decided he was going. He heard the children before he saw the building. Laughter, thin and bright, carrying over a chain-link fence that hadn't been there in whatever year the painting on the book's edge had been made. Inside the yard, a handful of kids chased each other around a swing set with one broken chain, while 2 older ones sat on the front steps folding clothes into cardboard boxes, The same careless, hopeful folding of children who don't yet understand that a box means leaving for good. Beyond the fence, on the street side, an excavator sat idling, its yellow paint the only bright color on the block. A construction crew was already stringing orange mesh along the perimeter. Silas stood across the street and looked at the gate. It was the same gate from the four-edge painting down to the curl of ironwork at each hinge, though the paint the miniature had shown fresh was long gone to rust. But it was the crest worked into the center of the gate that stopped his breath, a small oval medallion half hidden under a century of grime, bearing a pattern he had traced with his own gloved fingers a decade ago, kneeling over a manuscript in a climate-controlled vault 3 years before anyone accused him of stealing it. It wasn't the sterling crest, it was older than that. A binder's mark, the kind a workshop pressed into its finest commissions, the same interlocking pattern he'd spent 11 years cataloging in the margins of donated manuscripts before his life came apart. He had seen this mark before he ever saw the eagle and the broken scale. He simply hadn't known 10 years ago that he was looking at the beginning of something that would take this long to finish arriving. "Can I help you with something?" The voice came from behind him, clipped and unbothered, the tone of a man who asked the question purely as a formality before deciding the answer didn't matter. Silas turned. A man in a gray suit stood near the gate with a clipboard, flanked by a second man in a hard hat who was measuring the fence line with a laser level. "I used to work with materials like these," Silas said, nodding toward the gate. "The ironwork. I was curious about the age of it." The lawyer looked him over once, slow and unimpressed, then held out an open hand, not offered to shake, just extended, waiting. "Name?" Silas hesitated. 10 years had taught him exactly what a name could cost a man once the wrong person decided to write it down. Silas. Something shifted behind the lawyer's eyes, quick and cold, the look of a man matching a word against a page he'd read that morning. "Silas," he said it a second time, slower, like he was checking the weight of it against something. "You're the one from the recycling plant." It wasn't a question anymore. "Corporate's had a standing flag on that name for 10 years. Somebody upstairs still remembers the settlement." He was already reaching for his phone, thumb hovering over the screen. "Unauthorized equipment stoppage 2 nights ago, and now here you are getting curious right outside our fence. I'd ask you to move along." "I'm not on your property." "You're loitering outside a secured demolition site with a documented history of theft." He said prior record the way other men said something they'd stepped in, not even looking at Silas anymore. The way you don't look at something once you've already decided how it ends. "I'm sure the officers who respond will find that interesting." Silas felt the old shame rise first, fast and automatic, the flinch of a man who had spent 10 years being told what he was before anyone asked what had actually happened. He made himself breathe through it. He thought about the account number folded into his coat pocket, the gate crest he still hadn't told anyone about, the 3 days of unpaid suspension he couldn't afford to turn into something worse. He said nothing. He turned and walked back the way he'd come, forcing his pace slow, forcing his shoulders down, every step costing him something he didn't have much of left to spend. He was 2 blocks away when he heard the patrol car pull up behind him, crawling along the curb at his pace, the officer inside watching him without rolling down the window, waiting to see if he'd turn back toward the gate. Silas didn't. He kept walking, eyes forward, until the car peeled off at the corner and the sound of it faded behind him. Eleanor was waiting on his stoop when he got back, a thin cardboard folder pressed to her chest against the cold. "You went there," she said. It wasn't an accusation. She could see it in the set of his jaw. "I needed to see the gate." "And?" "It's the binder's mark, the one from the manuscript I was accused of stealing. I've seen it before, Eleanor, 10 years before any of this." He sat down heavily on the step beside her. "The building isn't just tied to the family that ruined me. It's tied to the book they said I took. Somehow, both of those things trace back to the same hands." Eleanor opened the folder in her lap. Inside was a single photograph, its edges soft with age, borrowed or copied from somewhere she still hadn't fully explained. It showed the interior of a library, tall shelves, a reading table lit by tall windows, a handful of children in old-fashioned clothes posed stiffly for the camera. Behind them, on the nearest shelf, a row of leather spines caught the light, one of them noticeably larger than the rest, its proportions unmistakable even in a photograph a century old. Eleanor said, "St. Jude's had a private donor collection. Before it became what it is now, it was funded by a single-family trust. I found this in the same file as the ledger, filed under a benefactor's name nobody bothered to cross-reference in decades." She tapped the oversized spine on the shelf. "That's your book, Silas, or its twin. Whatever you're holding came from that room." Silas stared at the photograph, at the children who had grown old and died decades before he was born, at the shelf that no longer existed in any form he could walk into and ask questions of. He said, "Someone took it out of that library, and someone hid 100 years of secrets inside it before they let it go." Eleanor closed the folder gently. "You said the coordinates from the poem led nowhere, the middle of the ocean. Maybe you were reading them as a place to find something." She looked at him. What if they were never meant to point at a place at all? Silas didn't answer. He was already reaching for his coat, for the account number copied in pencil on the back of an old receipt, the one clue in this whole ruined book that pointed at something he could actually walk into and ask questions of. The bank was 4 blocks from his apartment, a narrow stone building wedged between a shuttered pharmacy and a nail salon, the kind of branch that survived a century by looking like it had nothing left worth robbing. Silas gave the account number to a teller who read it twice, excused herself without explanation, and returned 2 minutes later with a manager whose smile didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "If you'll follow me," she said, and led him past the counter to a small office at the back, her heels clicking too fast against the tile for someone who wasn't in any particular hurry a moment ago. Silas sat. She sat across from him, folder unopened on the desk between them, and reached over without a word to twist the lock on the office door. The lock clicked home. The manager sat back down across from Silas, folded her hands over the still unopened folder, and studied him for a long moment before she spoke. "This account has been dormant for 91 years, she said. "Do you understand what that means in a bank like this one?" Silas shook his head. "It means nobody currently employed has ever opened it. It means the verification protocol on file predates every system we use now. No signature card, no photo ID, no PIN. Whoever set this account up didn't trust any of that." She slid a thin brass box across the desk, no bigger than a deck of cards, a single keyhole set into its lid. "It means we open the vault box exactly once in front of exactly one authorized person, using exactly what the founder left as proof. After that, the account closes for good. There's no second visit." Silas understood before she finished explaining. He reached into his coat and set the amber lens on the desk between them, the same one that had pulled hidden red ink out of a painted gate a day earlier. The manager's eyebrows rose a fraction. She turned the brass box over, revealing a second, smaller aperture cut into its base, sized for nothing wider than a coin. Silas held the lens up to the light, angled it, and fitted the brass ring into the socket. It seated with a small, definite click, the kind of fit that only happens when two objects were built a century apart by the same exacting hand for exactly this purpose. "There's a second step," the manager said, and produced a card sealed in plastic, a single line of handwriting reproduced on its face in faded brown ink. She held the poem's back page, the one Eleanor had unfolded 3 nights ago, alongside the sealed card. Silas watched her trace both signatures under a jeweler's loupe, comparing the pressure of every stroke, the low, deliberate cross of a single letter that appeared in both. "Match," she said quietly, and turned the small key that had waited in that brass housing for 91 years. The vault sat 2 floors beneath the street, reached by a narrow spiral stair that smelled of cold stone and machine oil. Box 004 was set into a wall of identical steel doors, indistinguishable from 1,000 others except for the number stamped above the handle. The manager withdrew once the box was on the table, leaving Silas alone under a single caged bulb. He lifted the lid. No gold, no coin. 3 things arranged with the same deliberate care as everything else this book had led him to. The first was a land deed, its paper thick and cream-colored, the ink faded but legible. St. Jude's Home for Children, held in an independent charitable trust, established a century ago, the property never once transferred, never sold, never legally available for any developer to touch. Clipped to it was a second document, newer, the paper crisp and modern, a notarized transfer filed 10 years ago, the signature on it belonging to a trustee who, according to a probate record stapled behind it, had died 11 years ago. A dead man's signature, backdated onto a forged transfer, the exact kind of clean, quiet fraud that could survive a decade if nobody with the right eyes ever looked at it twice. Silas had spent his whole career learning to be exactly the kind of eyes that could see that. The second was a bundle of paper certificates bound with a faded ribbon, each issued to the bearer, no name printed anywhere on their face. Bearer bonds, the old kind, before every transaction left a digital trail. Whoever physically held the paper owned the debt outright, no records to subpoena, no account to freeze. A ledger tucked beneath the bundle listed the compounding interest, decade by decade, the number at the bottom nearly unreadable through a century of careful, patient growth. $15 million, give or take, sitting untouched in a steel box, while the family who could have spent it let it sleep. The third was an envelope, sealed with wax gone brittle and dark, a single word written across the front in the same hand Silas now recognized without needing anyone to confirm it for him. He broke the seal. The letter inside was dated 101 years earlier, the handwriting elegant where the account manager's card had shown him only fragments. The Count wrote plainly, the way men write when they've stopped performing for anyone but themselves. He wrote about a shipment of silver he'd sent across the Atlantic in his youth, nearly his entire fortune loaded onto a single haul, and the storm that took the ship down somewhere past the point any map could recover it. He wrote about the years afterwards, learning the hard way that anything trusted to open water could be lost to it, and how he'd resolved from that day forward to keep what mattered close, physical, provable, hidden rather than risked. He wrote about the home he'd built for children with nowhere else to go, and his fear that men who valued land more than people would find a way to take it from them long after he was gone. and near the bottom, in a line that made Silas's hands go still on the page, the Count wrote of the man who had built this hiding place with him, a binder who never once asked for his name to appear on anything, who had simply shown up, decade after decade, and done the work in silence, because the work itself was the only recognition he ever wanted. Silas thought of a line of cramped, plain handwriting folded inside a hollow board, bound by hand for the Count by the man who taught me everything I know about paper and patience. He didn't know yet whose hand that had been. He knew, sitting alone under a caged bulb 91 years after someone had sealed this box shut, that it wasn't a stranger's. He was still holding the letter when the phone on the wall beside the vault door rang, sharp and sudden in the silence, a black rotary unit that looked older than the box itself. Nobody else was down here to answer it. Silas let it ring twice before he understood it was ringing for him. The voice on the other end was smooth, practiced, the voice of someone who made unpleasant calls for a living so the person paying him never had to. "Mr. Sterling would like to see you. Tonight, if that suits you. A car will be outside the bank in 10 minutes. It wasn't a request. Silas hadn't expected it to be. He rode in silence, the deed and the bond ledger held flat against his chest inside his coat, the sealed letter tucked beneath them, where his heart could feel the shape of it through 2 layers of wool. The car climbed away from the narrow streets he knew into a part of the city he'd only ever seen in the background of old newspaper photographs, wrought iron gates and hedges cut into shapes no plant grew into on its own. The house was stone, old stone, the same weathered gray as the gate outside St. Jude's. Above the front door, worked into the lintel in relief, an eagle spread its wings over a scale broken clean down the middle. Silas had spent 10 years trying to forget that shape. He stood beneath it for exactly as long as it took to remember why he'd come, then went inside. Sterling was waiting in a study lined with books nobody in that family had ever read, a fire lit in a hearth built for a room 3 times the size, a leather folder already open on the desk between 2 chairs. He didn't stand when Silas entered. He didn't need to. "Sit," Sterling said, and it wasn't hospitality. It was an instruction he'd given his whole life and never once had refused. Silas remained standing. Sterling studied him a moment, the way a man studies something he's already decided the value of, then slid a single check across the desk with 2 fingers, the number on it printed clean and confident. $10 million. "You've been busy," Sterling said. "Recycling plants, bank vaults, a little old librarian friend, I'm told, sneaking equipment out of a secure building at 4 in the morning. He leaned back, unhurried, a man who had never once in his life felt the floor move beneath him. "I'll save us both the theater. Bark all you want. Whatever you found down there, sell it to me. The deed, the forged transfer, whatever paperwork you're clutching under that coat like it's going to save the world. 10 million is more money than a man like you was ever going to see in this lifetime, and it makes this entire embarrassment disappear by morning." Silas said nothing for a moment. The fire popped once behind Sterling's shoulder. "10 years ago, your family put a number in front of me, too. Different number, same table, more or less. I didn't take it then either, and everyone told me I was a fool for it. I lost my career for being a fool." He reached into his coat, drew out the bond ledger, and set it down on the desk beside the untouched check, the century of compounding interest printed plain at the bottom of the page. $15 million. That's what your great-grandfather set aside 100 years ago to make sure a place like St. Jude's would never have to depend on anyone's mercy, including yours. Something in Sterling's face went still, the first genuine stillness Silas had seen on it since walking in. He didn't trust the courts to protect it, and he didn't trust his own descendants to leave it alone, so he built a room a man could only open with the right hands and the right patience, and he waited 100 years for someone to have both. Silas closed his coat over the empty space where the ledger had been. Being cleared of what your family did to me doesn't make me any cleaner than I already was, Mr. Sterling. It only makes you dirtier than you already knew you were. Your own blood paid this debt in advance, a century before you ever thought to try collecting on it twice. Sterling didn't move. His jaw worked once, the only sign that any of it had landed at all. And when he spoke, his voice had lost none of its polish, only its certainty. You understand this changes nothing about the demolition timeline. I understand you'll find out otherwise soon enough. Silas turned and walked out, past the marble hallway, past a second, larger version of the same crest carved on the floor beneath his feet, out through the front door and into a night that felt colder than it had an hour ago. He didn't look back to see whether Sterling had touched the ledger. Some men needed to be watched breaking. Silas found he didn't need to watch this one. The car that had brought him was gone. He walked. It took him past a post office he'd passed 100 times without ever having a reason to go inside. He mailed the forged transfer and the dead trustee's backdated signature in a plain envelope, no return address, addressed by hand to the fraud division of the federal tax office 3 counties over. He paid the postage in coins counted out of his pocket, $4 and some change, the last of what the week had left him. He didn't wait to watch it drop into the bin. He turned and walked home through streets going quiet around him, carrying nothing now but an empty coat and the particular kind of tired that comes after setting something down you've been holding for 10 years. Winter turned into something softer before anyone at St. Jude's noticed it happening. The demolition permit had quietly expired, unrenewed, buried under a federal inquiry nobody at Sterling Development wanted to draw attention to by fighting it in court. Silas heard about the collapse the way he heard most things now, second-hand, from a distance, never seeking it out. He was in the corner booth of the diner across from the bank 3 months later when the television mounted above the counter cut to a business segment nobody in the room was really watching. A reporter stood outside a courthouse he didn't recognize, delivering a story about asset freezes and a federal indictment tied to falsified property transfers, the Sterling name mentioned twice in a clip that ran under 40 seconds before the broadcast moved on to weather. Silas didn't turn around. He finished his coffee, left exact change on the counter, and walked the 2 blocks to St. Jude's the way he did most mornings now. The gate was open when he got there. Someone had oiled the hinges. The rust that had crept over the ironwork in the 4-edge painting was gone, sanded back to bare metal, and repainted the deep, patient black it must have worn when the Count first commissioned it. Beyond the fence, the excavator was gone too, replaced by a scaffold along the north wall where a crew was repointing a century of crumbling mortar, funded by a trust that had finally been allowed to do the one thing it was built for. Silas found a bench just inside the yard and sat down with a small wooden box balanced on his knees. Inside it, Wrapped in the same careful cloth he used for everything now, was a torn comic book a 7-year-old girl named Marisol had handed him the week before, with the kind of solemn ceremony children reserve for their most important possessions. The spine had split clean through. The cover had come away from the staples entirely. "Real justice," Silas said eventually, more to the comic book in his hands than to Eleanor beside him, "was never going to come from a courtroom or a headline or anyone clapping for what I found in that box." He pressed the last fold of the cover into place and set it aside to dry. "It comes from closing an old book, knowing the next hand to open it gets a clean page to write on." Above them, worked into the stone lintel over the front door, where it had sat unnoticed for 100 years, an eagle spread its wings over a scale broken clean down the middle. Nobody at St. Jude's had ever thought to fix it. Nobody needed to. Some things told the truth better broken than whole. He worked slowly, the way he'd always worked, humidifying the crease before he ever touched a blade to it, easing the cover back into alignment a fraction of a millimeter at a time. A rabbit hair brush swept a thin, even line of the same glue that had held a count's secrets shut for 100 years, the same glue that would hold a 7-year-old's favorite story together for a few more. He didn't take payment for this kind of work. He'd told the Trust's new director as much on his first week. He'd take a small wage for cataloging the collection Eleanor had helped verify came home from that reading room a century ago, and nothing more. His name wasn't on the Trust paperwork. It wasn't on the gate, or the plaque the children had painted for the front steps, or anywhere a person walking past might think to look. He preferred it that way, and nobody who knew what he'd carried out of that vault ever pushed him to explain why. Eleanor found him there most afternoons now, usually with a folder under her arm and a thermos she never quite finished. She sat down beside him on the bench, watching Marisol's comic book take shape under his hands. "I finally got clearance to pull the full ledger, the binder's logbook, the one with the handwriting I couldn't place." She opened it to a page she'd marked with a strip of paper, turning it so Silas could see. "It took me 3 tries to find the entry because he never signed his commissions with his own name, only with who trained him." Silas set down the brush. The page was a registry of apprenticeships, decades of names recorded in a careful, formal hand, until one entry near the bottom broke from the pattern entirely. A name Silas hadn't heard spoken aloud since he was young enough to still call the man who taught him everything he knew about paper and patience by his first name instead of his title. "He trained your teacher," Eleanor said quietly, "before your teacher ever trained you. Whatever this book was hiding, Silas, it wasn't waiting for just anyone to find it. It was waiting for someone with these hands. It always was." Silas looked down at his own hands, the same ones that had spent 10 years learning to be worth nothing, now holding a torn cover steady while the glue set beneath it. He didn't say anything for a while. Marisol ran past the bench, chasing another child toward the swing set, its broken chain finally replaced, and the sound of her laughter carried across a yard that would still be standing long after either of them were gone.